the volume shadow copy service and backup. In this nugget, we'll take a look at the volume shadow copy service, or VSS, and backup. VSS has several different ways to use the service. You can use it, for example, in conjunction with a backup solution. You can also use it to easily restore data for users without using a backup solution. We'll take a look also at how Microsoft has told us that there are certain implementations with tape that are very inconvenient and inexpensive. And we'll take a look at how the volume shadow copy service is better. We'll take a look at how to configure VSS in order to use volume shadow copies, as well as how to restore the volume shadow copies on behalf of the user. And even the user, in fact, can do this. And then we'll look at backup. There are various options within a backup that you can choose from. One of those options will be the type of backup you want, such as differential, incremental, normal, all that stuff. We'll look at the differences here. And then we'll also look at how to schedule a backup routine. Now, of course, backup is still going to have to be done even if you use volume shadow copy service, because VSS is not an archival solution for long-term backup. The volume shadow copy service provides a number of different services that can really help out the administrator. It really goes into a lot of what we'll be discussing for the remainder of our series here. It goes into your tape backups or whatever kind of backup you use. It goes into the ability to recover files quickly and easily without using a tape backup, and hopefully even without having to call an administrator on the user's part. So let's take a look at what the volume shadow copy service, or VSS, really does. And in kind of a quick nutshell, VSS is simply a way of preserving data so that it can be manipulated in other ways. You can use it with something like data transport. Now, we won't really be addressing that specifically, but you can use it to do something like offloading in a data mining scenario. For example, if someone needs to do complex queries on a large quantity of data, but they don't want to affect the performance of their live database, the volume shadow copy service can be used to create kind of a temporary holding area for data. Then you can just do your analysis based on this temporary holding area for archived data, so to speak. Then you can also use it for shadow copy restore. That's probably the best and most obvious use of the volume shadow copy service. And using this, hopefully you can even prevent your users from having to call you quite as often to get files from a backup. Then you can also use it in conjunction with your tape backup or whatever kind of a backup scenario you use. And this has great advantage in that it allows you to back up files that would have in the past been locked open and unable to be backed up. Well, now you can even back up, quote, live, unquote, data. Now, in terms of the usefulness for volume shadow copy and using volume shadow copy restore, think of this kind of scenario where we normally have to restore from tape. A user calls up and they're in a big panic and they say, hey, I just deleted a file off the server. It's critical. I got to have it in half an hour or my boss is going to kill me. I know you guys make backups every night of the server. Can you just go ahead and get out one of those little tape backup things you guys have and restore my file from tape for me? Thanks. Appreciate it. Next time we go to lunch, I'll buy. Well, I'll do anything for a free lunch, but I can't do the impossible, and restoring a file from a tape is probably going to be impossible in that kind of a situation. And that's where something like volume shadow copy restore comes in handy, because when you have to use a tape restore, it has some really interesting implications in terms of who has to restore it and the amount of time it takes. Let's go ahead and take a look, first of all, at some numbers that Microsoft put together that throw some light on this. First of all, Microsoft says about 34% of their file problems are attributed to user error. Now, I know in my organization it's got to be at least double that, but maybe that's because Microsoft has more technically savvy users or something like that. Anyway, so it's user error, and when they call you, it's usually they call the help desk first. And if the help desk can't fix it, then they call their supervisor. And if the supervisor can't help, then they call a systems administrator. And the system administrator then has to get a hold of a backup operator. And you see where this goes. You're going to have voicemails, a trail of voicemails here and there, and emails, and escalated help desk tickets. And after a while, it takes a while to get the level of help that you need. And that's, again, Microsoft's numbers for within their organization. Also at Microsoft, it takes between 24 to 72 hours to get that file back off of a tape, and in some departments between 3 and 7 days. So you see that this can take a little while as well, and nobody's going to get this file back in half an hour. Also, it costs Microsoft about $300 per restore operation from tape, just when they account all of the resources that are necessary to do that. Well, I have to tell you, I kind of have a pet theory here. I'll bet if you charged the users the $300 every time they lost a file, you'd get a lot fewer support calls, and people would lose a lot fewer files. Anyway, these are Microsoft's numbers, and I think they're pretty well reflected in a lot of organizations. Now, in order to enable the volume shadow copy service on a particular volume, I simply go to the properties for a volume by right-clicking and choosing properties, and then going to the shadow copies tab. You see that by default, all of the shadow copies are disabled on any of my volumes, but I can enable them simply by clicking Enable. For example, drive D has my home directory on it, and that might be important volume that I would want to be able to create shadow copies of. Now, of course, a shadow copy is going to create copies of my data and give me kind of a snapshot of previous points in time. It stores this data on the same volume by default. I can change it to redirect the copied data, the shadow copy data, to a different volume if I want to. For example, I might want to redirect the actual copy of the volume data onto drive G, for example. Maybe that's because I have high I/O when a volume shadow copy is created, and that is true. There is high I/O, so you have to be careful that you don't do this during peak times, because it is scheduled, and you don't want to schedule it during a peak time. Now, in order to do any of that kind of stuff, I would not just click Enable right now just blindly. I would go over here to Settings first, and I would do a couple of things. Number one, I could specify where I want that data to go. If I don't want it to go to D, I'll send it maybe to drive G, and that would be useful if it's on a SCSI disk and it's on a separate spindle, so I don't have such a performance penalty when we actually create our volume shadow copy. Now, drive D, where it attempted to originally locate the storage area, where we saw this earlier, was about a 120 gigabyte drive, and by default it attempts to use 10% of the disk size, not the available disk space, but 10% of the disk size for your storage area. Now, if I change to a different volume like I did here where I went to drive G, it does not automatically adjust this according to the available size of drive G. Also, so you might want to change that if necessary. Also, you want to go to the Details button here to look up more information about that disk. Here I see that I've got 36 gigabytes left on that drive, so I might want to adjust this figure upwards or downwards according to what might be more practical for our purposes. Of course, when it starts to approach this maximum available size, whatever you specify here, then it's going to cycle out the old ones for making space for the new ones. And if you choose no limit, it can store up to 64 volume shadow copies, and it will start to, again, cycle those out, the old ones, for the new ones on a FIFO basis. Now, twice a day, it'll attempt to make a copy, and it by default does this every weekday at 7 o'clock a.m. to begin with, and it also does it again at noon every workday as well, every weekday. You can adjust that as necessary, and you see you can apply a variety of different scheduling options down here. You can also go to the Advanced button here, and you can specify if you want it to end at a certain date, or to repeat the task in a certain fashion, and this is much like what we would have for a scheduled task that you might create in the Scheduled Tasks item within the System Tools. Now, you could add additional scheduled items here. Instead of just these 2, I could add 3 or 4 or 5 or however many I want, but Microsoft recommends that you don't go too often, like every hour or something like that, because the disk I/O, the I/O on the load is too high, and you would sacrifice your normal performance on those drives by doing it too often, so just be careful of that as well. Now, also let me point out that, I didn't mention this earlier, but when you choose to specify a storage area, it has to be a local volume. It cannot be something like a network volume, which makes sense, because you wouldn't want to choke out your network bandwidth with a high I/O load for shadow copied data. So we're okay with everything we have here. We'll just click OK. Once that's done, we'll then click on Enable. Now, another important reason, before I click on Enable, another important reason for configuring the settings first is that I cannot go back, after I've enabled my shadow copy, I cannot go back to settings and specify a different storage area. That has to be determined at the time that I enable the settings. So I click on Enable here. It tells me that it is going to have a high I/O load, and it's going to use the default schedule to begin with unless I change that. I'll go ahead and say yes to enable shadow copy, and it only takes a couple of seconds to create its first copy. And of course, if for some reason I wanted to, I could select that and delete it now. I would only probably do that if I wanted to make space for additional shadow copies, if I knew we had a whole boatload of new data that was coming in and I wanted to clear off some space for it. And as I said earlier, now that I've created shadow copies and I've enabled this, if I click on Settings, notice that I cannot change the volume. Okay, let's go ahead now and take a look at how I can actually use this on something like a user basis, okay? So we'll go ahead and click OK here, and then we'll manipulate some data and see how we can use the volume shadow copy service. So let's take a look at how this might actually work, practically speaking then. Here we have Phoenix User 01 logged on, and this is the secretary for the president of the company. They're working, you can see here, on a merger details with some other company, and they're putting together these details. They're going to propose this offer in about 10 minutes. And they're going to take it down to this other company where they have a meeting in a big conference room, and there's, you know, all the stuff that we don't usually get to eat, donuts and hors d'oeuvres and all that kind of stuff going on while they negotiate this stuff. Anyway, they're going to buy the new company for $5 million. They're going to move the new company to the Palm Springs, California headquarters, where it's beautiful and palm trees all around and the ocean and all that kind of stuff. buy a new H2 Humvee for all the executives. Wow, man, everybody, these people get everything. But look, with the humble employees, we all get free bus passes, so it's not like everybody's left out of this deal. Well, this this secretary gets a little bit disgruntled with that, and they say, I'm not going to really leave it like this. But for crying out loud, $5 million for that company, they're not even worth, $5. So I'm just going to fiddle around a little bit here while we're waiting for the meeting to start. New Palm Springs, California. Let's move them somewhere else they'd rather not go. How about, Yuma, Arizona? Gets to be 120 degrees plus in the summertime there. They'll all melt like, chocolate on a hot sidewalk or something. New Humvee for all executives? Oh, that's not going to be it. We need something more economical. How about a new scooter for all the executives? And then we'll give a new, Humvee to all the other employees. No, that looks about right. And then the boss comes in, and she doesn't want the boss to see all these things they've done. They say, "Ooh, I got to close this up real quick. Do I want to save it? I guess." Oh no. Oh no, did I just save that? Oh, they're asking me to come in the meeting right now. They got to get the file right away. I don't think I have time to change all of that. And in fact, maybe I do have the time, but I don't remember what all the details were right offhand. And what if I get something wrong? Now what am I going to do? Well, you see, since this was stored on a volume shadow copy, you can educate the user on how to take care of this. And you can either do this for them on your end, or you can tell them how to do it. But in any case, whoever does it, this is what has to be done now. Simply right-click on the file, choose Properties, and if this was in a folder, you could right-click on the folder as well if you wanted to. And then you go to a tab here that says Previous Versions. It looks like the interface is making a fool of me, and I don't like that. If anybody makes a fool of me, it's going to be me. That didn't come out quite right. But anyway, we have a little bit of a problem on this XP machine. Why is that? Because there has to be something called a previous versions client installed on this XP computer. You see, natively, only Windows Server 2003 systems will have that previous versions tab into their Windows Explorer interface. So, we got to fix that first. And here I've skipped ahead to where the actual file is that you'll need to install. On any Windows Server 2003 computer, for example, DC Nugget 1, where you say I've navigated here, go to the Clients Share, go to TW Client, and then go to the x86 for any of your x86 machines. There's also AMD and Intel 64-bit clients for this as well. In any case, there's the MSI file. Just go ahead and install that, and then you'll have the previous clients tab available. Now, since it's an MSI file, I strongly recommend that you do something like deploy this through SMS or through a group policy. And then offline here, just real quick to save a little time, I went ahead and installed this using run as for the administrator privileges. Now once we've done that, now we will be able to go back to our merger details. Hopefully they're not starting the meeting yet. We can right click on this, choose Properties, and now we'll see that we indeed have a Previous Versions tab. Whew! Saving the day here. Now then, here's what the user can do. Notice that they have two different previous versions here. So they say, I don't know which one's the good, which one do I want here? So they can just click on one of them and click on View. And they say, oh, that one's where I had this thing up at the top. I don't know if I want that or not. Wonder if I want that one or if I want this one. Well, just click View again, and there it comes. And they say, oh, that's the one without that little heading. I guess I'll go ahead and keep that one. So then all they have to do is to select the one they want, click Restore. Are you sure you want to do this? Go ahead and say yes. And that's pretty much it. It's been restored to its previous version. If I'm not sure that that's really the one I wanted, I could also have chosen copy to copy it to a different location so I'd have, both versions to work with and to compare, for example. Then I just double click on this, and what do you know, but we're back to our original buyout offer. Phew! Save the day, save the job, save everything else. We're great. Now let me also point out before we move on too much further here that when you do a volume shadow copy restore of a previous version, it does not restore its security NTFS properties the way a restore from a tape backup, for example, would. If I had copied that previous version also to a different location, or if I had restored that file to the original location, but the original file no longer exists in that original location, then the file will just simply inherit the permissions of the parent folder. Now, in that scenario, the user knew how to recover that data themselves, but what if they're in a big hurry, you haven't had a chance yet to show the users or to create an email to send out to them that they will all read very carefully on how to restore their own data using volume shadow copy? Well, if that's the case and you have to do it for them, you might be tempted to say, okay, they're on the phone, they're putting a lot of pressure on me, they want that file. I know it's on the D drive here, so I'll go to Home, Phoenix User 01. There it is. Okay. Now all I have to do here is just right-click on this, choose Properties, and then I'll go to the Previous Versions tab, which once again is not there. Now you're thinking to yourself, James, I thought you said that in Windows Server 2003, where we are right now, there was already a Previous Versions tab, and you didn't have to install any kind of client or anything like that. What's the matter? Are you telling us fibs, James? No, I would never do that. And if I did, I would make sure that you never caught me. Anyway, we don't have it here because, you see, we're accessing this through the file system. In order to be able to access the previous versions tab, you also have to be doing this through a UNC path so that you can use the Common Internet File System, which is CIFS, which is also just another version of SMB. In any case, that being said, all you have to do now is to go to a UNC path for that location, like //DC-1, or browse your way through my network places. Now that I'm accessing this through a UNC path, I can double-click on that users folder. Now I see their file, right-click, properties. Now we've got previous versions, and we can restore the data. Most organizations, when they use a backup utility of some kind, will purchase a third-party backup utility rather than using Microsoft's own NT backup utility. Now, that's not because Microsoft's NT backup utility doesn't work. It does what it's supposed to do. It's just that it's pretty limited in terms of the number of options that it's capable of and things of this nature. For example, we'll be talking about system state a little bit later on. With NT backup, you can only create a system state on a local machine. Most third-party products, you can now create a system state backup remotely from other machines across the network, which is a big plus in a large organization. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at the backup utility, though. It's found on the All Programs menu under Accessories, System Tools, and then Backup. And once we get to Backup, you'll see that it starts automatically in the Wizard mode. You can also run it in Advanced mode. Now, when we're in the Wizard mode, I'm just going to next real quick, but then I'm going to back out of this and go to the Advanced mode instead, just because I want to show you some of the options that are available from within the Wizard mode. Basically, you have two options. Back up your files or restore your files. And then it takes you through, if you did a restore, it'd take you through any backups you'd made previously, and you could select which one you wanted. Backup files and settings simply allows you to select individual backups for individual files and settings that you want, or you could do kind of a shotgun blast of the entire system if you want, which really turns out to be something called automated system recovery, and we'll look at that also a little bit later on. So for the time being, we'll go back and go to Advanced mode, which takes us to this interface, and if you're accustomed to working with Windows 2000, you've seen this, and it's almost exactly the same now as it is in Windows 2000, with the addition of this little button down here, which we'll talk about also a little bit later on. And then the only other difference really is something you can't see particularly, except for when you start the backup, it'll show you that it's using volume shadow copy service to prepare the volume or to prepare your files and all that. And that's the only other add-on to this, so that it'll be able to back up files that users currently have a lock on, for example, those files that might be open. Normally backup would not be able to back up those files because of the volume shadow copy service. It'll create kind of a temporary copy, and then it'll just back up that temporary copy. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at backing up by going to the Backup tab. This is very simple. You simply select whatever it is that you want to back up. For example, a home directory is something that you usually will back up regularly because that's where people keep all of their user data. Then you can choose a destination. If you have a tape backup or a tape backup library, that will be designated here. For example, I do have a Traven tape drive attached to this system. We won't be using it. We're just going to be backing up to file instead, because Traven tape drives, especially single tape systems like I've got right on this server, are very, very, very slow. I mean, my grass grows faster than a Traven tape drive can work, especially, again, on a single instance. Now, also be aware that the fact that you don't have to be an administrator to perform a backup. I mean, for example, Phoenix User 01 here, when they're connected to their home directory, they can run backup themselves from XP 2000, whatever they've got. They can back up their own files, and you can always do that. You can also back up any files that you have read access to, and you can restore files to any location where you have write access. Otherwise, if you need to back up other people's files or additional files besides those that you own for yourself, and that you would not maybe normally have read access to, you can be a member of the Backup Operators group, and as a member of the Backup Operators group, you can back up and restore anything pretty much. And then, of course, as an administrator, of course, you can also back up anything, and as a domain admin, you can back up anything from within the entire domain. Now, if you don't want to make someone a backup operator, but you do want to give them a little bit more granular capability to performing a backup, there is also, in policy, in your security policies, a policy that allows users to back up and restore data. And here I've quickly switched over to a group policy object editor where we go to computer configuration, Windows settings, security settings, local policies, and under user rights assignments, this is the item I was talking about, backup files and directories. And you can just double click on that to define the settings and then add a user or a group to this particular policy. And then without being backup operators, they could also just do exactly that, backup files and directories. Now, once you've selected the files that you want, let me just give you another visual clue with this. Notice we have solid blue checkboxes all throughout here. That means that everything in all of this, in the root directory of the backup at least, from home all the way down through is going to be backed up. But if I selected an individual file, I said, you know what, we don't really need that, then I could deselect it, then all of these go to gray. And that's just a visual clue that not absolutely everything from this point downward is going to be backed up. All right, then let's go ahead and take a look at some other things here as well. You need to name the backup whatever is appropriate and put it on whatever drive you want if you're going to back it up to file. And again, you can also use tape if you want to with this. Then once you're ready to start the backup, you simply click the button to start the backup. If I append this backup to the media, that simply means that it's not going to overwrite any media file that's already there. For example, I might already have a datahomebackup.bkf file there. Any existing data in there will remain, and we'll just kind of paste this onto the end of it. We can also replace the data entirely with the media, or rather with the data from this backup. Now, let me point out another important thing with the replacement here. You can also select, if you choose replace, to allow only the owner and the administrator access to the backup data. Might be a good idea, just in case if it's a physical tape, for example, it just falls into the wrong hands, or you left the cabinet unlocked where the tapes normally go in and someone might have snuck off with it, something like that. It just, helps to protect yourself. Because if someone takes that tape home, and that's another important thing about the tapes themselves, they must be securely locked up in a server room or in a locked cabinet or offsite or something like that. Because a passerby that picks up one of those tapes can take the tape home, and if they have a reader of that tape type for their own hard drive, or for their own systems at home, then they're probably the local administrators of their own machines. That means that they can restore that data wherever they want and put whatever permissions they want on it, and they can open up your entire organization. So that might not be a bad idea to limit the access here. Also, let me go back to this append item. If you're using media such as tape, then if you're going to append this backup to the media, then the tape that you enter in, that you put in the drive, must have the exact same label on it. And that doesn't mean a sticker label. That means the label on the media itself, and it must be identified exactly the same way in order to be able to append to it. Then you go to certain advanced options as well, if you like. Now, this first option allows us to back up data that's in remote storage. Let me talk about what remote storage is. It started with Windows 2000, and it's the capability to take files that are not used very often off of expensive hard disk storage and store it instead onto less expensive tape storage. It has to be tape storage that's on a SCSI interface, and typically it's going to be on some kind of a robotic library of some kind, because even though it's going to be on slower tape, it still needs to be somewhat accessible in a reasonable amount of time. And so a user, for example, will access that same data. They haven't touched it for a year, so now it's on a tape library on remote storage. Now they touch it on their network drive, and then it will retrieve it from that remote storage tape library or whatever it is. To the user, it still looks like it's on hard drive. In reality, it's on tape. You can also verify the data after the backup. That's not normally going to be necessary unless you have old tapes that are wearing out, or if you have dirty heads on your drive or something like that, or you get other inconsistencies in the restores. But normally that's not necessary, and in fact, if you're doing this with tape, it can take an exceptionally long time to verify the data, depending on how much you're backing up in the first place. You can also compress the backup data if the tape drive supports compression. I'm backing up the hard drive, so that's why we don't have this available here. And since we're not doing a system state backup, this is also unavailable. But if I did have system state backup, then I could also back up the system protected files, which would be anything in the system root. We can also disable the volume shadow copy, although I can't think of a good reason to do that, unless perhaps there'd be an application that's concurrently running with the backup utility that does not like volume shadow copy to do its thing. But otherwise, I can't think of a good reason for that. Now, let's also talk about the various types of backup that you have, and for this, we'll pause and take a look at some examples. Now, when it comes to the various backup types, it really all revolves around something called the archive bit. And that was what happens when you have a normal backup. You see, anytime you have a file that has never been backed up in the past, it will have an archive bit assigned to it. When you do a normal backup, then, it will then clear that archive bit. Let's go ahead and take a look at how that works. So if I go, for example, to just any drive into any folder here, and I right-click and choose New, just Microsoft Word document here. It doesn't even matter what I name it or anything. Now I'll go to the Properties, and if I go to the Advanced button down here on the General tab, it'll say File is ready for archiving. Now in the past, that just said Archive. Now in Windows Server 2003, it says file is ready for archiving, that is the archive bit that I'm talking about. So although it's checked right now because I just created it, and that will be the case for any new or modified file, it automatically checks that box for you. Once I run a backup utility, depending on the type of backup I use, it may clear this archive bit. That means that on the next pass for another backup run, it will not touch this file because this has been cleared, and it knows that it's not been modified, because if it were modified, then it would have automatically been reselected. Now, what happens with this normal backup is it'll go ahead and back up any files that I've selected through NT backup. Once I've backed up those files using the normal backup, however, it then goes back and it will clear the archive bit for anything that's already been backed up. Now, the archive bit and the normal backup are critical to what we do regarding an incremental or differential backup. We'll talk about these two kind of backups a little bit later on. But with an incremental backup, it also looks for an archive bit. Now, it will, since the data, this is what this represents, data, from Monday has already had all of its archive bits cleared, then when I do an incremental backup on Tuesday, it doesn't back up any of the data from Monday because all those archive bits were cleared. Instead, it only backs up new and modified data because as soon as I touch that data to modify it or create something new, those get the archive bit. Now I've got strictly the data from Tuesday. Now when Wednesday comes along, because Tuesday's backup cleared the archive bit with that incremental backup, and since Monday's backup cleared the archive bit with Monday's backup, then it will not back up any of the data from Tuesday or Monday unless it's been modified and had the archive bit reset. Therefore, the data set is going to be relatively small for each one of these incremental backups because really you're looking at pretty much only the data that's been new or modified in the last 24 hours between backup. Now, that means that an incremental backup, and you should remember this, an incremental backup is typically very fast on a daily basis. But when it comes to restoring data from an incremental backup, it is very, very slow compared to a differential backup. Well, let's continue our discussion of incremental when it comes to a restore, first of all. Let's say that somebody comes into work on Saturday and they say, hey, you know what, I accidentally deleted a file this morning and it was a file that I had created yesterday, so it might be in Friday's incremental backup. And they won't know how to say that, but you'll understand that. So you'll say, okay, now what do I need to do in order to get that one file back from Friday's backup? Do you have to get just the tape out from Friday? No. Because with an incremental backup, what you have to do is to get back out, first of all, the normal backup tape. So we got this tape here. Then you have to get out the tape from Tuesday. Then you have to get out the tape from Wednesday. Then you have to get the tape out from Thursday. Then finally get it out the tape from Friday. And if you're working with a single tape, you can see how this can take 72 hours to get all of the information back. So on the incremental backup, the restore is very slow compared to differential. And again, that's especially true if you're only working with a single tape. I said single tape, but I meant to say a single tape drive, where you have to constantly swap these out, because queuing up each one of these to the appropriate marks on the tape can take a long time, even hours, to get all these queued up right. Now, of course, on the other hand, if you are backing up to file like we would do here, like we started to do earlier, then that would be very fast, and I could use the same backup file to create both a normal backup as well as all of these incremental, and that would work very, very fast compared to tape. But for the most part, we'll assume that we're using tape because historically, that's where backups go. Now, let's talk about the advantages then and disadvantages of a differential backup. With the differential, we start off again with our normal backup, and we just back up all the archive data from there. Now, then on Tuesday when we do our backup, it's going to look mostly the same as an incremental backup because it's going to back up all the data for anything that is archived as well on a differential backup. The difference is it does not clear the archive bit when it's finished. So starting with Wednesday's backup, we'll start to see a difference. Since it didn't clear the archive bit, it will back up not anything from Monday, but it will back up all of Tuesday's data as well as all of Wednesday's data because it's never cleared an archive bit. And that's what the backup looks for in these kinds of backups, is the archive bit. Thursday, it backs up all of Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday's data. Friday, backs up Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday's data. Now you can kind of see how I've represented the data here with this, stringy-looking bar here, that by the time we get to Friday, the tape backup is taking longer and longer and longer throughout the week because each backup gets subsequently more data to back up. So, what's the disadvantage of a differential backup? You have a longer backup window that you have to work with. So if you have a narrow backup window and you have very little time to do your backups, you might have to stick with an incremental. On the other hand, if you've got all night to do a backup and you only keep maybe normal business hours and nobody's really using the servers at night, you got plenty of time for a differential backup. That might be recommended because now when someone comes in on a Saturday, guess what they need if they need a file from Friday's backup? They need only 2 tapes, Friday's backup and Monday's backup, and that's it. And then the only other potential disadvantage to using a differential backup is that you can see here by the quantity of data that's required on each day that it does require more backup media, so it requires more tape. And if you're on an extremely tight budget, you might not find that favorable either, whereas an incremental backup requires relatively little storage. Now let's take a look at the copy as well. With the copy, I can just make this a point-in-time copy. It reads any of the data, whether it's archived or not. It does not look for the archive bit. It just copies whatever you specified in the backup. And initially, this is much like whatever you might do with a normal backup. The only difference between the normal backup and the copy is, yes, they both will back up whatever you checkbox, but they do not clear the archive bit in a copy backup. This can be useful because you might want to do a copy backup to get a point-in-time reference between, say, Tuesday and Wednesday. You might create your copy backup here, and that way, since it doesn't handle the archive bit at all, then it will not interfere with whatever Wednesday backs up, and your incremental backups really have no idea that you've created a copy in here because nothing was manipulated in terms of the archive bit. And then you can also have a daily backup, which only copies the data from today's work. So anything that was new or modified on the current day is backed up. And again, with a daily backup, none of the archive bits are manipulated there either, so nothing's cleared. So anyway, I say all that to say, we're going to start with a normal backup, because that's what we'll normally do, is do normal and then follow that with differential or incremental. Now, we can also schedule the backup, and for that, you need to use credentials, because this backup needs to take place even if nobody's physically logged onto the machine, and it'll use whichever credentials you put in here. I would not recommend putting in the credentials of a domain admin or an enterprise admin or somebody like that. I'd probably enter in credentials of just a plain backup operator with no additional privileges, and this would probably be an account that no one actually uses to log on with, because you also want to set the password to never expire, and you also want to set the password so that the user can't change the password. That way, if it's ever compromised, then whoever tries to compromise that account cannot change the password themselves to something else of their choosing. So I just have a user account called BO. Don't misinterpret that. But anyway, just a user account called BO for backup operator, and then I have a password here. So we'll enter in the password and confirm it and click OK. And you can see from this message that I would also have to make sure that whoever's user account is specified there, BO in this case, would have to also be able to have read privileges to this particular backup job. And if necessary, I could just copy or move it to another directory where that account does have access. So then we just click OK, and then you just enter in a backup name for this. I might just call it a daily backup, and then I click on the properties to designate what I want it to do in terms of the copy or of the backup. I can schedule a task to run just one time. That's not going to be likely. Usually we want this to be run every day. And if it's a normal backup, like I'm doing right now, where I just do a normal backup on Monday and differential and incremental every other day of the week, then I might just change that to weekly, and every Monday I do my normal backup, and then I configure a different scheduled job for my incremental or differential backups. And then you see how else I can schedule it using these various options down here. And I can also choose Advanced, which looks much like, and actually it is, one of the schedule options that you see with the Scheduled Tasks item under System Tools on the Start menu. And this actually, when we complete scheduling this job, actually it does create a scheduled task. That's really all this is. So, for example, again, I could enter in an end date if we only wanted to back up data to a certain point. Don't really know why we do that in most cases, but you could do that. Then you can repeat the task on whatever rotating basis you decide here as well. And again, most of that will pretty much explain itself. One thing you can do is to cease the operation after a certain period of time. With tape backups especially, you want to go way longer than an hour because they could take quite a few hours, in fact. So you would set this duration to something reasonable, and then if something has hung up the system or has hung up the process, you can click this box to stop the task from running if it is still running after whatever you specify in this time period. And that will keep the whole system from getting gummed up, if you will. That's a real technical term, gummed up. Then also you can go to Settings and configure additional options. And all these additional options pretty much explain themselves. I'll just explain a little bit more about the idle time one. If you want to start the backup only when the computer's been idle for a certain period of time, this really doesn't really have much to do with tape backups in most cases. This is going to mostly be useful for other kinds of scheduled tasks that you have that might otherwise interfere with the user's normal operation. In this case, however, you could do it so that after the computer's been idle for at least 10 minutes, it will allow the scheduled job to go ahead and run. Now, at the scheduled time that it's supposed to run, let's say it's 9:30 at night, if it's not idle at that period of time for 10 minutes, then normally what would happen is it would just completely stop, unless you specify a period of time down here so that it will keep retrying up to 60 minutes. And then after that, you can stop the task if the computer ceases to be idle. This might not be recommended for backup jobs, however, because you will only get partial backups, and in some cases, that's really as bad as not having a backup at all. So anyway, the rest of that pretty well explains itself, and then you can go to click OK if that's exactly what you want to do. If you do want to schedule it, I'm not really going to schedule it, so I'll just click Cancel for the time being. And then we would simply click Start Backup, at which point we see that, again, Shadow Copy is preparing the volume to use Shadow Copy so that any files that the user had open would still be able to be backed up. And then when the backup job is complete, it tells you how long it took, what it backed up, and then it also gives you a report which allows you to identify exactly what took place with this backup. We don't see any alarming messages or anything. Everything seemed to have worked just fine. This would tell us if there were certain files that it did skip. That does take place occasionally, even with volume shadow copy, because there are certain system files that are locked and that cannot be backed up even when you use volume shadow copy. But they're normally not something to be alarmed about. In this nugget, we took a look at how to work with Volume Shadow Copy service as well as the backup utility. Now, the Volume Shadow Copy service has several functions that it can do. Number one, it can work in conjunction with the backup utility, for example. You can also use it on the user's behalf so that even the user can restore files that they want to get back. And that compares to restoring from tape, which is very inconvenient and expensive, and we saw that by looking at Microsoft's examples. We also saw how to configure the Volume Shadow Copy service on the server, and then how to restore it from both the client and or the server if you like as well. Remember that you have to access the restoring capabilities from a UNC path. Then we looked at the backup utility. This is pretty much the same as we've had from previous versions of Windows. However, there are some differences, and we looked at the various options that are available. Some of the options that are available are the type of backup that's available, such as a normal, differential, incremental. We looked at all those. As also, we looked at the schedule of the backup and saw how to do that as well. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.